Our lead story tonight is about this number, $8.3 trillion. This is what China's local governments owe to their creditors, $8.3 trillion. This debt pile overshadows the GDP of many nations, from Japan to Germany, India, the United Kingdom and France, among the biggest economies in the world, but no match to China's mountain of debt. For years, investors have been worried about this debt, and somehow China has managed to survive it. But kicking the can down the road is not an option anymore. China is facing the perfect storm of debt. Loans are coming due at home, overseas defaults are growing, and China is under pressure to take a haircut on bad debts. So where is all of this going? Tonight we'll put together the numbers and the trends to find out, and we'll start with China's debt troubles at home. That same $8.3 trillion pile of debt, it's at home. What kind of loans are these? This is borrowing by local governments, loans that were taken off the books to fund infrastructure projects, to support the local economy. These loans have a special name. They're called Local Government Financing Vehicles, or LGFVs for short. And what are these LGFVs? They're special entities. They're created to enable off-the-books borrowing. I know it sounds dodgy, and it is by design. It was supposed to be this way. This method was invented in the 1990s. It's a way for local governments to dodge borrowing rules. Because Beijing had banned local administrations from raising money. So they started circumventing the official channels. And these special entities, or LGFVs, helped them do that. They enabled local governments to borrow from investors both inside China and outside. Now, over the years, local governments got used to the system. The LGFVs became their go-to source to raise cash. And soon the borrowing got out of hand. Loans through LGFVs represent 48% of China's GDP. 48%. These loans are now as big as official government borrowings. Experts call this debt a black hole because they're off the books. So no one really knows the true extent of this problem. And $8.3 trillion is just one estimate. Some experts believe the actual figure is much higher. Either way, this is a problem that cannot be put off anymore. There are talks of a bailout. Some provinces are in financial distress in China. They're lobbying Beijing for a bailout, like the government of Guizhou. Guizhou is among the most indebted governments in China. This month, they sent out an SOS. Local officials published an article online, and I have some quotes from what they published. Due to limited financial resources, it is extremely difficult to advance debt relief work. And it is impossible to effectively solve the debt problem by relying on the local government's own ability. The survey found that debt has become a major and urgent problem facing local governments in the province. This is what they posted online. Do you know what happened next? The post was deleted. Classic Chinese behavior. When officials see a problem, their default response is to cover up. But this is becoming too big and too widespread to hide. In December 2022, a local government was in trouble. It could not keep up with its loans. So it got a partial bailout from lenders. The terms of the loan were rejigged. Short-term loans were turned into long-term debts with lower interest rates and a repayment tenure of 20 years, which basically means lenders will now have to wait longer to get their money back. Because Beijing has refused to help. Beijing refuses to give a bailout to these local governments, and this message has come from the very top. 3 months back, Chinese mouthpieces published this, and they quoted China's Ministry of Finance. I have that copy with me too. Listen to what it says. China will deal with hidden outstanding local government debt in a law-based, market-oriented manner without resorting to central government bailouts. So no bailouts, that's the message from Beijing. The question is why? Why can't China bail out local governments? Because the Chinese state may also be running short of cash. All thanks to the Belt and Road Initiative, the pet project of President Xi Jinping. It has become the Belt and Road of bad loans. The project has come to a grinding halt. There's a string of bad debts. In the last 3 years, debts worth over $78 billion have failed. $78 billion of debts in BRI. These were loans given by Chinese institutions. They were for roads, railways, ports, airports, and other infrastructure projects the world over. And what happened to these loans? They've either been written off or their terms have been renegotiated. And in both cases, the result is the same. China's money is stuck. What's worse, they're under pressure from global institutions. That's the third part of their problem. The likes of the World Bank and IMF, they're all asking China to forgive more debts, especially to poorer nations. And the most prominent case is that of Sri Lanka. Colombo recently got a bailout from the IMF. That's the International Monetary Fund. They're giving $3 billion to Sri Lanka. Last year, the Lankan economy collapsed. There were shortages of all kinds, from medicines to petrol. Protests rocked the country. A president and prime minister were ousted. India stepped up to help Sri Lanka, but China dragged its heels. It's one of the biggest creditors to Sri Lanka. So far, Beijing has refused to waive any loans. And now we know why. Because Beijing is being squeezed. On one side, you have local governments that are in distress, that want money. On the other side, you have overseas debts that are failing. So China, even with its very fat checkbook, cannot foot the bill for every default. Like I said before, this is the perfect storm. And Beijing is trying to avoid it. It may now be a matter of when and not if. One big default and China's debt bubble will burst. This contagion will be hard to contain. Our next story is from India, of how India is emerging as a global manufacturing hub. And tonight, we're not talking about just another manufacturer, we're talking about tech giant Apple. It is completing 25 years in India and it has big plans for this market. This week, Apple CEO Tim Cook will be in India. He's inaugurating the first Apple stores in the country. So far, Apple sold products in India through local partners. Tim Cook will also attend some high-profile meetings while he's here, like one with Prime Minister Narendra Modi, also India's Electronics and IT Minister Ashwini Vaishnav. And the agenda of these meetings is pretty clear. Apple wants to increase its manufacturing base in India. Apple wants to make in India and ship across the world. And this is a major shift because so far, China has been the hub of Apple's manufacturing operations. But as the world decouples with the dragon, India is emerging as a compelling alternative. So Apple is looking to manufacture in India and it's opening stores. It's also working with Indian app developers. Apple says it supports 1 million developer jobs in India. And reports say India will push Apple to make more iPhones here. Right now, Apple has 3 manufacturing partners in India: Foxconn, Pegatron, and Wistron. And they're all expanding their India operations. They're shifting 12 to 18% of Apple's total iPhone assembly operations from China to India. 12 to 18%. Already, key Apple products are being made in India, like the iPhone. 5% of the world's iPhones are now made in India. By 2027, Apple wants to boost this number by 10 times. It wants to make 50% of its iPhones in India. So Apple is bullish when it comes to India, and the company's India pivot did not happen overnight. They began working on this in 2016, only now they're accelerating. That's because the shift away from China has become inevitable. Tim Cook's love affair with China is well known. In 2015, he'd explained why Apple makes its devices in China. Let me quote from what he'd said. The number one reason why we like to be in China is the people. China has extraordinary skills. This is Tim Cook speaking. The products we do require really advanced tooling and the precision that you have to have. The tooling and working with the materials that we do are state of the art. And the tooling skill is very deep here. In the US, you could have a meeting of tooling engineers, and I'm not sure we could fill the room. In China, you could fill multiple football fields. So that's why Tim Cook wanted to be in China. And he has no intentions of giving up on Beijing just yet. Last month, in fact, he was again in China. He met with the Chinese premier. He hailed what he called Apple's symbiotic relationship with the country. It was a word of assurance. It was basically a message to Beijing that Apple will not completely abandon China. But like every businessman, Tim Cook must contend with the present-day geopolitical realities. Tensions between Washington and Beijing are at an all-time high. The US has slapped a slew of sanctions on Chinese manufacturers. And the situation in the Taiwan Strait is even more volatile. Apple cannot afford to be caught in the crosshairs of a US-China fight, which is why it is keen on expanding in India. As far as Apple is concerned, this diversification is the need of the hour. And India is a clear beneficiary of this pivot. And India should make the most of it. It should use the case of Apple and lure more vulnerable businesses away from China. Our planet is a water world. 70% of the Earth's surface is covered by it. Yet we know so little about what goes on underneath. So tonight, let's turn our attention to the ocean. It is vast and enigmatic, and it has a leak. There's a hole in the ocean bed. It's off the coast of Oregon in the US, and it's leaking. Sounds fascinating, but scientists are worried. Some are even calling it the harbinger of doom. This leak could trigger a massive earthquake. It has been predicted, feared, and even raved over. Some experts say it can shift our poles and wipe off Los Angeles entirely. Here's a report.
The big one is making headlines again. But beware, it's a cute nickname for some serious doom and gloom. It has welcomed some big what-ifs, also some existential humor. Now, a small hole is creating giant problems for it. Before we ambush you with any more adjectives, let's tell you what is the big one. Its official name is Cascadia Subduction Zone Earthquake. Yes, an earthquake, and a very large one. It can occur in the Cascadia Subduction Zone. This is a 960-kilometer fault off the Pacific shore, capable of producing earthquakes of over 9 magnitude. Here's a fun fact. The big one is expected to happen, but no one knows when. Scientists say it can happen within the next 100 years. But a new problem may invite it sooner. And it has everything to do with a leak, which is happening in a quake-prone region. There is a hole at the bottom of the ocean. It's in the seabed off the coast of Oregon, a state in the US, located on the Pacific Northwest sea floor. Scientists say that a hole like this has never been seen before. The world has known about it since 2015. That's when it was first discovered. It's called Pythias Oasis, named after an oracle. He's known to have hallucinated prophecies while sitting on a hot spring. So maybe this naming logic does make sense, because this is a mineral-rich spring. Now the University of Washington has come out with new research. This hole is leaking, releasing water that's almost fresh, but not into the earth, upwards into the ocean. And water is coming out of the seabed like a hose. The study says this leak could trigger a big, bad earthquake. The internet even has a name for it, the harbinger of doom. Some say it could be one of the worst natural disasters ever. Others think Los Angeles could be wiped off the map. Some even say there can be a global pole shift. But don't start building your bunkers yet. Why? Because none of this is backed by science. So what do the experts say? This leak is releasing a fluid from the fault zone. Think of it as a leaking lubricant, and that's bad news, especially for earthquakes. A lack of this lubricant can build stress under the Earth's surface, leading to an earthquake. But research is still underway. We don't know much about the potential dangers yet, or how bad they could be. So while we can relax for the next couple of decades, this is surely a scary reminder. Because a large quake was felt along the fault in this region. It has been 323 years since that happened. Scientists say another one may be long overdue. And with this ocean bed leak, the sands of time may also be leaking faster than you may think.
And there they go. It looks like
The US and Russia are dangerously close to an armed conflict. This year, 2023, New Delhi will be the capital of global diplomacy. For a country as diverse as ours, with 88% of the population illiterate, it was a very big deal to write a constitution, and that too, the world's largest. Meanwhile, if we may, here's a Republic Day gift from India for the BBC. A list of suggestions for the BBC for their upcoming documentaries. Number 1, the Kohinoor and the colonial loot. Number 2, an outdated monarchy and unhealthy obsession with the royals. Number 3, racism in 2023. We're waiting.